Hello, everyone, and welcome to the, I think, fourth, maybe even fifth JoyPac webinar. And we have two awesome guests today as well. So I'll let them introduce themselves. Ioana, why don't you start?
Hi everyone, I'm Ioana from Game Analytics. I'm the CEO of Game Analytics. Some of you probably already know us or work with us already, but at Game Analytics, we work with more than 50,000 active games right now. All time, we work with more than 100,000 games. We track about 2 billion mobile game players from around the world, so we have a really good overview of the industry. Particularly in HyperCasual. So we are going to, I guess, I'm going to speak today about our perspective from, this side of the industry.
Cool, thanks. And Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm the CEO of Tenjin. We simply help mobile app developers measure their marketing return on investment. So if you're trying to grow your apps, we tell you if you're making a good return from the marketing dollars that you spend.
Cool. Yeah, and I'm Falko. I'm with JoyPac. We are a hyper-casual publisher with offices in both Europe and Asia. Used to be very specialized on bringing games to China, still doing that, but also working with a lot of developers on new and exciting ideas. We have this new Hyperfuel model that we introduced a while ago, where we work directly with some studios to start working together from the concept stage on to bring like new exciting games to market. We're still having some people coming in, so we'll give it a couple minutes. I would say that I just launch a first quick poll so we can get a feeling of like who our audience is and how prepared they feel they are for the IDFA changes. And in the meantime, I give a little bit of an overview. What is IDFA? What has happened so far for us to give us like a base to start our conversation on. So I'm launching this right now. Feel free, everybody attending, to click that. Yes, and as I said, we're talking a lot about IDFA and how that leads into the next year and what kind of opportunities we're going to see in the next year, and also what challenges are coming up. IDFA, for people that don't know, stands for identification or identificator for advertisers, which basically allows different advertisers to track what users do in the app, to kind of like follow users through the experience from seeing the ad in another app and then actually ending up in your app. And that was introduced by Apple. This is exclusive to iPhones, but there's a similar system on Android devices. On iOS, Apple introduced the system, I think, in 2016. And while there's an option to disable this was always on by default. And now the big change that Apple initially said will roll out with iOS14 is that this will be opt-in and not enabled by default. So the first time you go into an app that has this kind of system, it will ask you if you want to be tracked that way. And what everybody is expecting right now is that going from currently about 30% of people that actually go into the menu to disable this, that will shoot up to 90%, changing the landscape of how advertisers will be able to track the customers in the different kind of apps. All right, and I'm going to close the poll now. And yeah, it's pretty clear. I mean, this is probably also why you're watching this webinar, but 75% of people say they're not well enough prepared for the IDFA changes. 30% just enough, and under 10%, only 8% saying that they feel that they're very well prepared for the IDFA changes. And we'll see if after this discussion, this will change one way or the other. Once we're diving in how complicated the whole thing is, what you can do already, and how you may have to shift the things that you're doing in the future. I want to start off pretty broad, just for getting your impressions on how do you think IDFA will affect the market in the first couple months after it goes live, which currently we're thinking is going to be early 2021, although nobody really seems to know for sure, right?
Should I take that, or either of us can take that?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, sure.
Go ahead, Chris.
Okay, so we at Tenjin believe that this IDFA change will be very, very impactful. We see this mostly with companies that participate in helping developers figure out their attribution methodologies. Simply speaking, you cannot track across different publisher apps. So from our estimates, we actually see, only 20% or even less than 20% of people will opt into getting tracked as users. So essentially, at least 80% of all traffic will not be, percent of all users will not be able to be tracked. Now, I think there are multiple downstream effects of this, at least from an attribution perspective. We don't see a lot changing, from the mediation or analytics perspective. Ioana can certainly shed some light there. But the way that certainly how you figure out where users come from will change drastically on iOS, and we also anticipate this happening on Google as well. We will start to see counterintuitively more data science being required, more computations with different types of signals being used to do attribution. So we'll be moving from a very deterministic world using IDFA to a non-deterministic world using various signals that can be seen from an application. Funny enough, our team actually just posted something this morning on our blog about the different things that we see in the market, and how there's actually a lot of different methodologies out there that haven't been confirmed from our perspective as usable with Apple. Some people are actually taking like a blind approach to things, like they're just ignoring that things will change. We very much disagree with this. We think that this is a major shift in how marketers should be measuring their ROI or even verifying that they're getting return on investment. Some people think that the opt-in rates will be high enough, to which we don't think that's true. Some people think that fingerprinting technology will save them. Apple has definitely said they're against this. Third-party IDs are definitely out, in our opinion. So if you're using third-party IDs to track across different publishers, we think that this will get banned actually by Apple. So there's a lot of myths out there that certainly we want to make people aware of. We have our own solutions coming out that sort of don't use any of these techniques that Apple is against, but we are very much siding with Apple on this change. And we expect to also build things around this same type of methodology for Google in the future as well, regardless of what Google decides to do.
Super interesting. There are a couple points I would like to loop back to later, but I'm also, of course, interested in Ioana's angle, what you are seeing there. If people that already use the system, I know that game analytics is often first seen as something that is used for tracking in-game stuff like retention and these kind of things. But there is a big angle of like feeding data from the UA funnel, sort of monetization into it as well. So are people already reaching out to you about this? Are you preparing for it? What is your opinion on what things will happen?
So people generally ask for advice. I would say I echo a lot of what Chris has said. We see, let's say, a general push towards. So we integrate with a few attribution providers, but we see a general push towards probabilistic. I just refer to it as fingerprinting, same as everybody, but people, some people in the industry keep insisting it's not fingerprinting. So yeah, but anyway, probabilistic attribution. and a combination of probabilistic and opt-in rates, right, and trying to increase opt-in rates. I think third-party IDs recently, as Apple's become more vocal about this, are starting now to die off as an idea, even though I think they were some people's first idea, for sure. And what we see, or let's say the concern that I have, is that there's a very big difference between studios who can actually just afford attribution and studios who maybe are not there yet. So I think, you know, attribution companies, whatever method they use, I think we just trust, also from knowing these companies, that even though they take slightly different approaches, the approaches will have, let's say, a sufficient degree of accuracy, so that developers gain some additional insight compared to not using attribution at all, right? So it will be better to have it than to not have it. This being said, again, not everybody is ready to pay for attribution. For some people, the extra accuracy that they get if they don't have enough player volume may not be, you know, sufficient, or they won't be able to maybe running the models for their specific data to get enough information. And I think this is where studios expect a lot from us, from Game Analytics as a free provider, to be able to tell them something anyway without, you know, doing that. The approach that we are taking is that we want to start, you know, collecting some campaign data from the UA side. So we have started working on a solution for this. We've been laying the groundwork, and maybe next year we're probably going to launch this. It's not an easy thing to build. There's so many ad networks, so many different models of data that need to be integrated. The attribution providers have, you know, worked for years on doing this well. And we, for instance, will not do attribution. So people, it's a very common question that we get, like, why don't we get into the attribution space? It's a very, you know, complex space to get into, where you have to see both sides of the funnel. And, you know, again, invest a lot either in probabilistic attribution or in connecting to everybody. What we want is to give people an idea of, here's how much you spent, and here's how much money you made, and here's which user groups are the most profitable. So you'll be able to analyze your ad revenue data and to see campaigns, you know, per region, so like at a high level. But you won't be able to see this user specifically came from Facebook and made you this amount of money. So, you know, we will probably start to serve within next year this part of users who want to have some information about their profitability, but cannot maybe afford attribution or are not ready to get attribution. But I still think that for people who do UA at scale, an attribution provider is necessary, and we won't cover that gap. And, you know, then you just need to go and pick a company like Tenjin and work and build your own data science models, and so on. So really, yeah, I know that's not, you know, that's not a very fixed answer, but I think again, the answer is that studios' lives are becoming somewhat harder through this change. But at the same time, I think it's also a bit of an equalizer in many aspects, where you know, even though not everybody has attribution, the information that attribution provides, although it will be valuable, it will be very valuable at scale. So if you're a level, you know, let's say a smaller or mid-sized studio, the playing field for you specifically probably gets a little bit better comparatively to how much information people have right now. You will actually have a little bit more, they'll have a little bit less, and you'll probably be actually a little bit closer together than you would have been, let's say, a year ago. So life will somehow get harder, but the gap of knowledge between studios will also get a little bit smaller. So if you do use the information that you have well, you should become a little bit more competitive after this change. So you do more work, but you can get more out of it.
It's very interesting that you mentioned like how it will affect different studios in a different way. Do you think there's like a certain kind of studio maybe that operates in a certain genre that will be affected more? And is there maybe something alternative that people can do to kind of check if their campaigns worked? Or maybe do they have to think completely out of the box and start running TV campaigns, but implement like bonus codes for special items like PC MMOs would do?
So for sure, I think the studios that are the most affected are studios that probably rely the most on a small group of highly profitable users that they need to bring into their games, because they won't be able to tell when they're buying these players or not. This is why, you know, some of these companies are now just outright buying other publishers. So we see this consolidation with like buying hyper-casual publishers to kind of get a bigger user base to advertise to. Now, people won't say this, but kind of this is one of the perspectives that we can look at it, right? So for sure, it's the biggest challenge for advertisers who depend the most on very high LTV per player, like $60 per player, right? At the same time, these are also usually the people who can afford to kind of spend the money on the best tools available. So they will also find, and they have very sophisticated data teams, and they can probably like get the best advice in the industry. So I wouldn't say, you know, we're crying for these studios specifically, but yeah, I think it matters most to them. Again, the challenge will be more for the smaller studios who are trying to break into this market, and who will need to get make a fine balance between you know, what campaigns they run and their how those players behave in their games if they're not able to do like super in-depth analysis immediately. For instance, I think Tenjin have the ability, and Chris, you know, I'll probably hand this off to you, but as far as I know, you guys help people with custom analysis to actually be able to answer some of these questions, even if they don't have an internal data team already, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Our approach to that question is that there's potentially going to be an even larger barrier to entry. Like some of the larger, like I was saying, some of the difficulty is that counterintuitively, developers will need even more data understanding. Because you have less granular data to work with, you have to do a lot more correlations. You have to do a lot more general understanding of like statistical analyses that require you to understand attribution, or like understand where users come from and how like profitable they are. So under the new sort of paradigm where basically you can only, you know, have IDs for your own users using the IDFA or anything that's Apple sanctioned in this way, a lot of statistical methods will be employed, and those statistical methods require a certain level of understanding that only, you know, the top developers have on their own. So for us at Tenjin, we're actually trying to bridge that gap, and we see that as an opportunity to help the smaller developers bridge that gap for the ones that don't have it in this sort of new paradigm. So I think the interesting point will be is that like a lot of the attribution providers today, they all revolve around some kind of standard, which is usually like last click or last impression or view through or whatever it is that they set for themselves. But more or less it's understood in the industry of how to deterministically attribute a user. In this new type of paradigm where IDFA is opt-in, or in fact, in my opinion, basically deprecated and not usable, there is no standard. So what Tenjin decides to build versus like any other attribution provider decides to build for its customer base could be very different, since there's no standardization. And what developers should also be realizing is they need to make sure they ask the right questions about how each provider handles things around the terms of service of Apple. You don't want to get your app rejected for like some reason you don't understand, or the ways that they actually calculate, let's say, an attribution, or the ways that you will measure your ROI. You don't want to necessarily go into some type of black box scenario where you don't know anything about what's under the hood. And then further downstream of that, you know, analytics companies like Game Analytics will ingest this information somehow. And you know, it's interesting. It'll be an interesting time to see how those companies will deal with a non-standard environment. I think, you know, it it sounds kind of crazy that there's no standard, but there really is none in this new iOS 14 type of world. And there will be new, I would imagine there's going to be new emergence of people trying to solve the same problem. And we will see which ones have product market fit and which ones don't, and which ones are accepted by Apple and which ones are not, and then how Google reacts, and so on and so on. So it's really starting from, in my opinion, the world will start from almost ground zero again, and we'll have to rebuild all of the infrastructure that and the ecosystem around it itself in order for people to come to a standard. I mean, it's taken, I think, from the time that attribution was actually first introduced on mobile, it really took like at least 4 to 5 years before there really became some sort of standard around things. And I think this will happen all over again.
If I can add something though, because we focused, you know, a lot of, let's say, on the negative side or the challenges here. I think there's also one group of studios and publishers who, although, you know, everybody's affected by this, of course, but again, hyper-casual, because it's very much volume based, and you know, users have let's say a very small individual value but very high value as a group because that group is very large. I think it's probably easier there to just control your CPI. You know your general LTV. If you keep your CPI generally under that LTV, things should work. You do need, you know, like typically probably studios, it will be harder for them to experiment individually and get to, you know, to that right balance on their own. This is where, you know, a publisher like you guys, Falko, can obviously bring a lot, because they come with that knowledge kind of built in, where, you know, how do you remain profitable during, you know, after iOS 14? If you do it, you know, you do it for 5-10 customers, you could do it for everybody at some point. But I do think that for hyper-casual, the economics don't drastically change that much because of its broad appeal to many consumers. So you don't necessarily have to find like the one right consumer that will spend $50 in app. As long as you make 1 cent per user and you can scale that, you still have a solid business model. So I do think that, you know, people keep waiting for this hyper-casual wave to die down, but actually after iOS 14, and it's also the ads, you know, it's powered by ads, which was like the big problem with like, oh, you know, ads and data and user privacy and so on. But it's really what iOS 14 is doing is making it even more necessary to do many ads per user to keep that LTV high and that CPI low and take a at scale approach, because you don't know who those individual people are. So you can only go for like a spaghetti at the wall type of situation, which, you know, it kind of leads studios to then go into hyper-casual because that's where they have the most predictability. So, you know, just buy tons of users, make a bit of money, and any user who likes to play simple games will do. So I actually think hyper-casual will continue to develop and grow, and it will be for core gaming that this is more of a challenge than it was before.
That's an interesting point. It's not that hyper-casual companies are completely without worry about this. One specific thing that comes to mind is that hyper-casual companies were accused for a long time that they're just shifting money around each other, right? Because there has to be new money that enters the system, and that very often came from kind of like mid-core-ish, more hardcore-ish games. So do you think there's maybe a secondary effect, or maybe this changes things? Maybe CPIs go down for everybody and suddenly it's interesting for Coca-Cola or like big brands like this to advertise wider and also in games. How much of an impact is that going to have? And then actually a good question from the audience was, this also, of course, means that ads will be completely untargeted and maybe irrelevant for people. So is it maybe difficult for a game that relies so much on ads that you suddenly start seeing ads that have nothing to do with your interest, that are just feeling like they're robbing your time, especially because hyper-casual games rely so much on interstitials. So is there maybe like a secondary effect to hyper-casual games, if not the one that
sorry to interrupt, but it's like, is
No,
there
go ahead.
anybody who hasn't seen those like bonkers Garden Escapes ads, which had nothing to do with the game anyway? Like, it really gets more irrelevant than that, and they still worked, right? Like, that's why people use them. So I don't think, I think the industry is already the ad industry is already throwing everything it can at people. And again, the ads were already, in terms of games, we know how ads are targeted anyway, right? It's essentially, a lot of them are actually targeted very broadly. A lot of the data science that is done is still done internally, right? So once I got my users, I will analyze what their behavior is, and I'll try to put them in campaigns and do funnels and do this and that internally. But in terms of acquiring users, especially acquiring millions and millions of users on an ongoing basis, I think the targeting was still quite broad, with few exceptions. And I do think that will kind of continue to happen to a certain extent. However, I think your point that it may finally be the time when brand advertisers also get involved, I think that could also happen because I think there's two effects. One, CPI is indeed getting somewhat lower, because even that group of users that used to be acquired with data, like, if that's not even possible anymore. And two, because gaming is becoming more and more a lifestyle for everybody, not just a lifestyle for gamers, right? So, and I think brands are finally catching up to this and realizing that regular consumers play games in the bus on their way to do shopping, or while they're like waiting on Netflix to load something or whatever. So the purchase experience for brands and the gaming experience are much more intertwined due to kind of the snackability of these games than they used to be. And it took brands a while to catch up, but I think they have. So it's becoming more legitimized. So I do think that those two effects combined, lower CPIs with this emerging knowledge that this is happening, is going to contribute to maybe brands starting to dip their toe. But it's probably going to be a small, like still just experiments for now. But it's probably slowly going to start again, to just after the CPIs, they're low right now because of COVID anyway. But they're going to start to inch up next year again as brands dip in and so on. After and the economies also start to recover. I find it hard to believe that they could go lower, too much lower than they are right now. Maybe a bit, but I think right now, with everything that's happening, they're low anyway. And to your point, actually, we've seen a much bigger drop in CPIs from advertisers going out of the ad market than we've actually, we haven't seen any effect for iOS 14 yet, but when COVID hit and all the like travel advertisers and all of these guys went out of the market, CPIs dropped in half. So it was clear that it wasn't just gaming companies moving money around. There was a lot of ecosystem demand that was being pulled in by just regular brands anyway, and this is likely going to increase.
Yeah, I mean, I can echo some of that as well. Like, aside from like market systemic shocks, like let's say if you take out the whole COVID scenario, the anticipation I have is mostly that all stems from the fact that what was IDFA really used for? It was used for very granular, specific targeting purposes. And who uses that the most? Like the ones that have $60 paying users. So those people will generally be harmed the most, in my opinion. They won't be able to submit, an IDFA to Facebook anymore and say like, hey, target people like this. In fact, like Apple went even a step further, I think, a couple days ago in their terms of service, saying that you can't even do this with emails anymore. If they catch you doing it with emails, like, we're going to ban you. So Apple's really like locking down on this whole privacy narrative. And of course, they have a solution for it, right, which is Apple sign-in. So like, the point is that, what are they trying to get rid of? They're trying to get rid of the ability to say, okay, this user, you should like create experiences just for that user. The market for those types of advertisements will basically go away if you take the generic, what do you call it? Like the Apple intent, I would say. Like Apple's intent is to get rid of that, regardless of, like, there is not going to be a workaround solution. Don't try to work around this intent, because Apple will like catch you eventually. You'll have to like pay the toll. It's much better, in our opinion, to like pay the toll now, get your systems up to date so that you don't have to like, you're going to have to change the way you do things. I suppose in this world, where privacy is very much considered and you cannot target individual users anymore, or hyper target these users, you could say that hyper casuals in this way have an advantage, where the economics are just so different. Their customer bases, their user bases are broader, right? So you can basically send an ad anywhere to any user, and people like that. It doesn't matter as much. The people who rely on those $60 paying users will have a much harder time identifying, like, okay, where is how do I get ROI on my ads? I think the net effect of it will be just more volatility. So instead of saying precisely I should bid, $30 on this ad for this user, I'm just going to have more volatility in how I bid. I might be overbidding for some users. I might be underbidding for some users, because your bids will be completely generic at that point. And so, but the net effect of it, I think the averages will be the same, right? You kind of will just have an average CPM, but your volatility will just be a lot larger. And I know of some developers that are trying to take advantage of this volatility, but I think that's going to be the net effect of it. Is, what this all means is, like, Apple doesn't want you to target individuals, and that's their whole narrative. And it's starting with the IDFA. I think it's carried through with like third-party IDs, and it's now into emails. So it's an Apple almost vendetta. So better to be prepared than try to work around it.
Yeah, that interestingly, like, that loops back to what you said before, that you also expect Google to have similar changes in the future. Do you think this is just the start of a bigger push towards privacy in mobile environments? It's like, what else do you think is gonna change? What else do we see going away? Because right now there are still like a lot of things that there's so many games that when I say like, oh, I don't want to be tracked, I get a big banner that kind of like ruins the game experience, right? But just to make me push to kind of like activate that. So do you think like all of these kind of things will be much more strictly controlled? Do we see the same thing in the Google environment? What else will come next as kind of like a privacy push?
Yeah, I mean, Apple and Google have very different business models, right? So Apple makes their money selling phones. Google makes their money selling ads. So one is going to fight for, they're using this. Apple will use the narrative to basically try to win over its competition, and so will Google, as they are actually competing narratives. Taking the example a step further, let's say with email, right? Like Apple has a solution where you have Apple sign in now. The developers actually get some type of, it's not the real email address. They give you like, not a hashed email address, but some like fake email address basically, so that you don't know the real email address. Whereas Google's login is like, it's actually your Gmail account, or it's like your real email account. And so there are different ways that both of those companies will pitch that to developers. Who wins out? I think nobody really knows, but I think, and that's sort of the interesting part. from our perspective, at least at Tenjin, it's not going to be harmful to side with a more privacy-centric approach and just do an apples to apples type of build for Google. Yeah, that's kind of how I think about it right now. But they're basically, taking shots at each other with different narratives. That's all.
I would say that there's also an expectation that Apple will create this problem and they will also create the solution, and do more with ads and increase their service revenues other than just their phone revenues, So there's also this perspective. It may not be immediate, but it may be that just Apple turns out to be the solution to everything.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, they're using the privacy narrative for sure to sort of shore up their user trust. And I think, like, if they sell more phones, then they are able to utilize their ad networks for those phones. Yeah, it's one of those. I think it's one of those marketing type of things where they have their own ad network as well, right? Like, what are they doing with that? But yeah, I think this goes into sort of like a very different situation where, like, to me, I think Apple is just trying to sell more devices using this narrative.
One thing that is, I mean, it's like, it's not that people limiting the tracking, and I mentioned that in the beginning, it's not that that's completely new, right? Like, those numbers have been rising throughout the years. For our games, we see, depending on the game, on the geos we have it live, anywhere between 30 to 40, maybe even 50% of limited ad tracking already enabled for users. So do you think like people have already started to prepare for that, or maybe people overestimate the impact in some areas because they're not really aware, like, hey, this is practically already happening for almost half of our users. And yeah, like, how's the situation in like already preparing for something because it's kind of already happening, or like maybe ignoring isn't as bad as people think?
Sure. So there are definitely statistics out there where half of their users are on limited ad tracking. And in those cases, we actually see a drop in, for example, Facebook spend, or spend on like a SAN network, where those integrations completely rely on IDFA. So if you're using an attribution partner that has an integration with a self-attributing network like Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat or any of these guys, all those connections will be severed when IDFA is opt-in. There is currently no understanding of how the industry will react to this. All of those networks, all of those self-attributing networks now will need to use Apple's solution for SK ad network. But the attribution providers still, to this day, don't have a very clear understanding of how they want to talk to each other, simply because even to a certain extent, like SK ad network wasn't really working or testable until like a couple weeks ago. And so, there's sort of this like chaotic moment that's approaching where only now things are testable. People have been sort of trying to test it, but SK ad network itself didn't work for a while properly. Now it's starting to work where you can kind of test it within your apps. And the SANs themselves are still a little bit lost of what to do, like with this SK postback data. They're starting to send it, for example, in some cases to attribution providers. Then the attribution providers now need to figure out what to do with it and like how to make the best use of it. We are ourselves like working through that problem of how to best use these SK postbacks to do what we call attribution modeling, like a signals-based approach, essentially. And there are some out there who who have been relying on IDFA lookalikes for so long that they're trying to kind of ignore this, and they're going face to face with Apple on it, right? Like, how you're ruining my business. What are you gonna do? How can we like still do our business without you ruining my business? Blah blah blah. And so this is still getting hashed out, in my opinion. I mean, Google and Facebook are one of the biggest advertising networks out there that utilize iOS as a platform. And those two guys are basically going head to head saying like, hey, you're ruining my business. What are you gonna do about it? And you know, there's all these like antitrust things going on simultaneously in the background, right? Like it's kind of like this whirlwind scenario that you have simply around like deprecation, kind of like a perfect storm of sorts. To see what nets out of this will be certainly interesting, to say the least.
So you think right now it's really hard to tell also, like, of course, the big ones are the ones that are probably be able to stand up for themselves. What about like all the other kinds of ad networks that are out there, like very different approaches that we have been seeing? Do you think there are some that are more prepared for this than others? Will some suffer more than others? Can we already do something to kind of like, hey, maybe I should learn to integrate these guys or work with those kind of things more closely? Or should we just sit back and wait until they like figure it out, fight it out, and then once the dust has settled, then we see who's left?
The reality will be, and the practical approach is that for, you know, probably the first half of next year, at least on the non-SANs, things will be pretty much as normal, because no one's going to be willing to take the risk on something like this. Like, you can still use tracking links that don't have IDFAs, and they still work with non-SAN ad networks. The ones that people will really be shocked by, in my opinion, are like the SAN ones, where all of those direct connections and MMP exclusivities for those APIs will basically break. And I think that's going to be the first wall people will need to get over. And they're going to need to find a solution to how they measure those return on investment situations. And whatever sort of nets out of that, I think will then be applied to the non-SANs. So it's sort of like this step-by-step approach where my understanding of how developers work, and the smarter ones are working, is like, we need to figure out the non-SAN way to measure. And when we figure that out, we can then apply that to the, or sorry, we need to figure out how the SANs, we should measure the SANs, like Facebook and like Snapchat, for example. And then we'll figure out how to apply that to the non-SANs.
All right, cool. I want to shift gear a little bit here. I wanted to talk about testing a bit, because it's not only about like finished full games that are out there. It's also, and especially maybe in HyperCasual, it's figuring things out early and quickly. Like we use game analytics, for example, very heavily to rely on kind of like what happens in the first 2 or 3 days when we spend like limited amounts to see how people behave. And of course, on the UA side, we want to get a quick impression of the CPI, because it's not like stable in the long term necessarily for a game, but it's we can usually rely, when we start testing something, that within the first 48 hours we're going to see some numbers that will be a big indicator of like how well the game will perform later on, and if it's worth like investing more into it, sometimes based on like very early prototype. How do you think this whole thing will affect early testing, and what are maybe some workarounds for stuff that's going to happen?
Sure. So there's a very good question, and I was going to say, I think the important thing for studios right now, what they can do is to just measure their LTV a lot sooner. Like, it used to be a year ago, for instance, that for prototypes, people looked only at engagement metrics like retention, playtime, and they looked at CPI. And right now, I think it's quite important. And you kind of assume, you kind of assume a certain LTV almost based on the engagement metrics. We actually encourage people right now to do something we call ad ops, just kind of like live ops, but for for hyper casual games, and to measure their ad frequency from the prototype stage, measure their ad revenue, and really A/B test the prototype not only for the core mechanic but for the ad strategy as well. So look at the increases that you have in LTV with an extra ad or a change in ad placement or type, because you will you will have more variance in how your ads perform, I think, and you will need to just know very early on for this predicted CPI, even if that CPI goes down slightly at scale, and once you let the targeting run, you get to a good CPI. So you assume that, let's say if you got 17 cents maybe during the prototype stage, or 20 cents, you can get to like 2-3 cents less once the targeting starts doing its thing. You really need to make sure, because you're not going to be able to have the same level of control that you did before over the CPI. You need to make sure that your LTV will be worth it from the game. So your biggest factor will be the game and the ad strategy in the game if you monetize with ads. We spent all of this year building these capabilities into game analytics, and they are free to use. So you can track your ad frequency and a bunch of information about your ads using something we call the ad event. And you can do A/B tests with all of these things and then see how this impacts your LTV. And we're also supporting more ad revenue providers. So we already support MoPub and Fiber, and we're adding right now Iron Source. We're almost to the point of releasing Mac support for Macs. So by the beginning of next year, when iOS14 is out, you should be able to do that for most of the large mediation providers. So I definitely recommend doing that, doing ad ops for your prototype and A/B testing your prototype for ad LTV, because it will be the single most important thing that helps you make decisions. We even we compare games ourselves occasionally, since we have ad revenue data, and we look at how engagement metrics relates to LTV. And sure, like a lot of the time, obviously games with better retention, better playtime have higher LTV, but you will find games that do really well, like they have half of the session length, but they have comparable LTV because they manage to kind of do the most of the time that they have from the player, or they have more sessions. The first ad in every session is very valuable. So if even if the session is shorter, they tend to make money that way by having more first ads. So there's some really interesting methods in there, and I think people are going to get more and more creative with their ad strategy. And so I definitely recommend you doing that. And like I said, it's free to do right now. So I honestly think it should be mandatory for analyzing prototypes before launching, to just test LTV as well instead of just engagement.
I would agree. I mean, LTV as a metric certainly won't change in terms of the early stages of a game. I think what will be added by Apple, like in terms of conversion values and how that's treated by networks, will also play like a very big role. So like with this new SK ad network conversion system, it's still unclear like how each ad network chooses to use this system. So at least from our perspective, people will need to test their games in conjunction with how they set up their conversion values that they do send to SK Ad Network, and how they decide to act on those conversion values within the realm of testing. So if you're, for example, going to launch a game, putting a lot of thought into where you set those conversion values, how you measure those conversion values, and how you spend against it will certainly change. I think the biggest shift that we'll all see is that the ones who are most affected are, again, the people who have like who rely on high targeting things. Like you'll see, I think, less testing in Facebook, for example. You'll see more testing in like non-SAN networks, simply because they're cheaper and like there's no real ability to tell the difference between users. And so, you know, when you start thinking about testing, you also, like before and still is, you test to scale. And then a lot of these developers now know that you can still, you know, buy ads on Facebook that target certain like specificities within Facebook, but to scale beyond that like isn't as applicable anymore. And so that is, I think that's going to be a shift where you'll start to see more testing within non-SANs, just generically. And it also depends, again, you know, it's sort of circular, like it still depends on how it, like all of these conversion values are implemented. And these are very big unknowns for developers. So when you go out there and like talk to ad networks about how to test, try to really understand like what they're doing with conversion values, because all the ad networks are doing very different things with the conversion values. Some are ignoring them, some are using them. How are they using them? All very different.
Cool. Okay, we're almost coming to an end here. I would like our audience, was great to see you at like between 50 and 60 people there the whole time, to maybe send in a couple more questions if you have. We can get to one or two of them. I want to start one more quick poll about HyperCasual specifically, because also you just mentioned it depends on how specific you need to be. And what we talked about before, I would just like to know if people think, will this affect hyper-casual games in a big way or not? And at the same time, while people giving those answers, I would love to do the end of the year, we only have half a month left thing, where you look into your crystal ball and give me kind of like your predictions for 2021, IDFA related or not. Ioana, you want to start, and just like, what do you think the next year will bring for mobile gaming?
I genuinely expect a new period of growth. So as advertisers start to come back into the market, I think you know, it will push CPIs up to some extent, but also eCPMs. So I think we'll see, you know, we'll continue to see a very effervescent market. So more studios, you know, making money, launching games. New entrants still coming into the market. I do expect we're going to continue to see, you know, like ironSource announced their intentions to IPO. You know, I expect some people and some other players in the industry will follow. So I think it's going to be a year of general growth and excitement in the industry. And that a lot more resources will be continued to be poured into the industry. So on one hand, into, again, the ad side with all of these investments, IPOs, and so on. On the other hand, advertiser money, I think, will start to be pouring in again from other advertisers than just games. And on the basis of this will be kind of like a virtuous circle where more players will come in, more companies will be launched, you know, there'll be, and that will continue to escalate. So I'm really, you know, I really think next year will be a good year, and hopefully we'll start to wipe away the memory of 2020 from everyone. Yeah, that would be me. I'm optimistic for next year.
How about you, Chris?
Yeah, sure. So I would say we're going to see a lot more focus on, you know, broader types of games, like more broadly applicable to like a larger range of audiences. I think this is the safer bet that a lot of publishers will have. At least that's from the app developer side. From the tooling side, you're going to see a lot more innovation, I guess, whatever that innovation could be. Like, because there are so many unknowns with how the platform will work and how marketing changes, there will be companies that come out of the woodwork trying to come up with new solutions. You'll probably get a lot more acronyms than ever before. And developers will have to weed through all of that while still trying to like build these broader set of games. I do see opportunity in that as well. I mean, I think with every type of platform change like this, there's like a new sort of opportunity that exists. It's not like users have stopped liking games, right? So I do think that the way that those users find those games will change. And so there just needs to be new technology that supports that. Yeah, that's what I think.
Cool. I have one question from the audience that I think is interesting. Just quickly for the poll. Answers are all over the place. So from changes in UA strategy, which the most people expect, but also a decrease in revenue, about half the people voted for. All the answers, all the possible answers, got a lot of people picking them. So people, yeah, apparently believe that there is going to be a strong effect on hyper-casual games. And that one question that I mentioned, not directly connected to IDFA, but kind of leans into the things that are happening in UA right now already, is that for a couple weeks, even months now, we saw like a bit of a spike in CPIs, and people said it had to do with like things that were happening, elections first, then it was leading into like the Thanksgiving, Black Friday thing. Now people are like, yeah, it's probably because Christmas is coming up. Do you think that's actually because so many like bigger events were like crammed into the end of the year, or is that kind of like a trend that we're already seeing for CPIs just to rise to a higher level, maybe at least until the IDFA changes are coming in? Does either of you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, sure. So from my perspective, I think people are just trying to get their fix in before it's over, before this new technology is here. And that's mostly, I think, caused by the fact like, okay, let's get as many users as we can target right now. So yeah, I think that's what it is.
Cool, interesting. Yeah, that's for us. We're also, of course, looking at this. It seems to go up and down, and depending really on the game and platform right now. But yeah, we're hoping that it's going to stabilize a little bit next year. But yeah, if you're right and people are still gonna... Oh yeah.
I also think, by the way, that a lot of people just sat on their money, not necessarily within gaming, but in other industries as well, because this year was so uncertain. And there's also kind of a trend to just, actually now we have all this budget left for the end of the year, so let's just do something bigger now. So I also think there's like a more general wider effect. Sure, there's all these retail events, but the fact that now the end of the year is close, so people actually have to, typically spend their budgets, or are willing to take more risks because, next year is now expected to be somewhat better anyway, with vaccines announced and so on and so forth. So it feels like they can now kind of release some of this tension and some of their budgets along with it, I guess.
That makes sense. I mean, like I think yeah, it sort of goes back to one of the comments I made about volatility, right? I think this uncertainty will breed more volatility. I mean, it's not like the averages will change. Like if you looked at it over a long period of time, it's like, okay, more or less the same. But I certainly think that these types of behaviors will happen where it's like, oh shoot, I didn't spend my budget, spend it all now, and like the volatility will spike. Or whatever reason, just uncertainty brings this type of volatility. I think there are strategies actually in that, like opportunistic ways to, like, if you can mitigate the volatility, for example, then you will have a better way to like take advantage of it. And so this is why I'm saying like more data analysis is actually needed than sort of before. So these types of things will change how people, and it changes all of the processes downstream of that. The way you create ads, the way you deploy ads, all of those things kind of need to be rethought of. But there's opportunity in all of it.
Cool. That is a great, hopeful end. We're running out of time here, so yeah, I wanted to like thank you guys for taking the time and being here and teaching me and the audience all these things. You heard it all. Like, data analysis is becoming more important, and so you should definitely go to Tenjin and Game Analytics and check those out and use those tools to kind of like get ready for this. And of course, if you're a developer and you have exciting games that you want to get published, reach out to me or my colleagues at JoyPac. We're also hiring right now, so look up our positions on the website. And yeah, that is it from my side. Anything you guys want to plug before we head out?
No, thank you very much, Falko, for having us.
Yeah,
Awesome.
thank you. And thanks everybody for listening. Bye, guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Bye, guys. See you.
Bye.